Hey Rebel Rouser, I'm Alan Voivod, and this is Star Wars 7x7, your daily dose of Star Wars joy, and thank you so much for joining me for it. So, a few weeks back, we did a deep dive on episode 3 from season 2 of The Bad Batch, and that focus of the deep dive was about the complexity of the transition from clones to stormtroopers in the Galactic Empire. Prior to season 2 of The Bad Batch, we'd been given basically 2 reasons for why they transitioned from clones to stormtroopers. Number 1, that stormtroopers were cheaper than clone troopers. That was Tarkin's deal. And number 2, that the rapid aging of the clones would eventually lead them to no longer be useful soldiers for the Empire, and so it was just gonna have to happen anyway, and sooner rather than later. Then the solitary clone came along, and we heard from Commander Cody that more and more of the clones were going AWOL. This is a line that's echoed by Captain Rex in episode 8, Truth and Consequences, when he tells the Bad Batch that more and more of our brothers are waking up to the truth of what's been done to them and that he can't turn his back on them. And you can read that in a couple of ways. One of them has to do with morality and ethics, the idea that the clones are seeing what the Empire is doing and it goes against their moral code, and so they have said, yeah, that's enough, I can't deal with it, like what we presume happens with Commander Cody. And the other thing has to do with the Order 66 chip itself. We know that the chip can degrade over time and there can be issues with it over time, but how long does it really last? Does its functionality really last? How long can it be relied upon to help control the clone troopers? So those are basically the 4 things that we had as a potential explanation after the events of the solitary clone. Now we have Truth and Consequences, and we find that the answer has actually arrived, and it is complex, and it's also manipulated masterfully by Palpatine. The scenes we see in the Senate don't really suggest that the problem is with funding the clone operations. If anything, the only resistance to funding the clone operations is the fact that they're no longer at war and they don't need the Emergency Powers Act anymore. But as Palpatine puts out there, protection and security are necessary for the people in the galaxy, and considering that there are quote-unquote insurgents, did I just say? Insurgents in the mid and outer rim, that's a justification for keeping some kind of trooper active. So funding doesn't seem to be an issue. The second thing is the decommissioning because of age situation that we talked about. That does seem like it is playing a role here. It's brought up in the Senate a couple of times, and everybody seems to accept that as reality. The only real question is, what do you do with these soldiers when the purpose for which they've been created is no longer a purpose for them? So that's another morality conversation that they have to have, and I'm betting the Empire is going to treat them badly. I wouldn't be too surprised about that. Moving on to the third possibility about how more troopers are waking up to what's been done to them, and the Empire is basically violating their moral code. Partly that, and partly that they were manipulated by the Republic and by Palpatine himself in this way. So that certainly could be playing a role. And Palpatine definitely needs an army, so seeing more people defect, more clones defect, yeah, that has to be part of his calculus in all of this. And then there's the fourth thing, which is that chip. Is it breaking down, or the other possibility is that it was really only there for getting the Jedi out of the way? Certainly the clones serve their purpose in fighting this war between the Republic and the Separatists, but there was also that one little bit which was meant to deal with the Jedi, and that's it. So the clones did their job, and the Republic fell, and Palpatine became the Emperor. That's it. That's basically all he needed the clones for. So now actually the issue becomes the fact that in the short term, there are clones that are still going to be viable for combat for another few years, and if they are in increasing numbers waking up to what's been done to them, we now have a military force that could oppose the Empire and create, as was mentioned in this episode, additional difficulties for Palpatine. So it behooves him to get them out of the way and get stormtroopers up and running as quickly as possible to be able to counter this threat that he has essentially created. The end result is that the transition from clone troopers to stormtroopers is still a definitely complex situation. And what's more is that it opens up the possibility for some really fascinating stuff to be happening between clone troopers and stormtroopers over the course of the rest of the season of The Bad Batch and possibly even further beyond it. So that's what I've got for you on our deep dive into Truth and Consequences, episode 8 from season 2 of The Bad Batch, and that is going to do it for this episode of the podcast. It just remains for me to say thank you so much for joining me for it, as always, and may the Force be with you wherever in the world you may be.
7x7 is not endorsed or sponsored yet by Lucasfilm Limited, Disney, or 20th Century Fox, and is intended for entertainment and information purposes only. Star Wars, the Star Wars logo, all names and pictures of Star Wars characters, vehicles, and any other Star Wars related items are registered trademarks and/or copyrights of Lucasfilm Limited, or their respective trademark and copyright holders. May the Force be with them. All original content is copyright 2021 by Star Wars 7x7. We hope you love it.